Thursday, November 14, 2022, school board work session. The school board would like to take this moment to respectfully acknowledge that we are residing on the traditional lands of the Dene people. Our mission is to provide an excellent, equitable education in a safe, supportive environment so all students will succeed and contribute to a diverse and changing society. Ms. Richards, can I get a roll call, please?
Mrs. Smith,
Here.
Mr. Doran,
Here.
Mrs. Burnett,
Here.
Mrs. Hardy,
Here.
Miss Marati,
Here.
Mrs. Sanderson.
Here. This work session will be,
Quorum.
thank you. This work session is on the foundation formula, and Mr. Gra will provide a report with the PowerPoint for us this evening. Mr. Gra, thank you. Go ahead. Let you take it over.
Yep. So before Mr. DeGraw begins, this presentation is more foundational, and we'll get into the more detail of budget processes later. But again, with new board members, hoping to help them get an idea of how we come to the number that we come to through our funding formula, and then a little bit of what we have to look forward to.
Go ahead, Mr. Gra. Thank you, Ms. Moline.
All right, thank you. So, yeah, as Ms. Moline mentioned, kind of a general overview of where we're at with our budget, and then we'll do kind of, not a deep, I wouldn't say a deep dive of the foundational formula, but I'll take a few moments and describe at some length the foundation formula that where we get our state funding through. Before I forget this, if any of you would like to come in and sit down with me, the door is open invitation to sit down with me and take an hour and answer questions and get you oriented, especially new board members. I'm always available. And more tenured board members, whoever, just to be able to get you answer questions. And it's going to be a challenge this year. So all the more important to make sure that we have all the questions answered and I can clarify things as needed. So
Thank you, Mr. Graf, for that. I was going to make that reference, but I'm so glad that you have an open door policy where we can get educated. Thanks.
absolutely, that's why I'm here. So I think one of the keys, especially in challenging budget environments, is transparency, clarity, easy to understand terms and whatnot. So that's very important to me is transparency and clear information to stakeholders, the board, the community, et cetera. So without further ado, we'll jump in. The district has three main funding sources. We here in Alaska don't have the ability to raise dollars beyond these three funding sources: local, state, and federal. So the majority of our local revenue comes from the local contribution that the borough grants to us. The majority of our state funding comes from the foundation model, which we'll go into a little bit of detail here in a moment. And then on the federal side, it's federal impact aid is the main bulk of those dollars. The foundation formula, it is in Alaska state statute, so that is state law, the formula by which we receive that funding. Approximately 55% of total funding comes from the foundation formula. And then there's two main components. It's a lot of different things that factor in. There's tons of stuff. It's a crazy spreadsheet. But there's two main drivers. One is ADM, and that's enrollment, average daily membership. So when you hear the term ADM, it means enrollment. And then the other factor is the BSA, the base student allocation. That's the main multiplier number that we multiply our enrollment by to get our funding. Okay, so enrollment and then the multiplier, the number of dollars we get per student. And it's more than just each student we get. There's a number of different factors where we multiply and magnify the number of the adjusted enrollment that we get. And I'll go into that here in a moment. And Ms. President Sanderson, I don't have any opinion on whether sometimes we hold questions, sometimes we ask questions as we go. I have no opinion on that. It's at your pleasure how you'd like to manage that. So
I'd like for you to go ahead and go through your presentation. Our two new board members, this will be beneficial for them.
perfect. And then questions at the end. Okay, sounds great. So on the ADM side, here's a 10-year look back to 2013. You see there in 2021, the COVID effect, school closure there. And then we've rebounded the last couple of years. Hopefully, we're hoping to continue that trend over the last 2 years into next year, and we'll see how that shakes out. But we're about just shy of 600 students short of our pre-COVID enrollment number. And then here is the famous pencil chart. This shows the BSA figures over the last, that's 11-year, looks like. And you see 5930 that was the last increase in 2017. We do have a $30 BSA increase in FY24. It's important to note, however, that is attached to the READS Act. So, I can't speak to intent of the legislature, but that $30 increase, pretty nominal, less than 0.5% increase, and attached to the READS Act, which adds some additional requirements to school districts around the state. This is page 20. It's hard to see here, but not to worry. There's a link to our budget on our website. This is page number 20. This is a one-page snapshot of the foundation funding formula, but I'm going to go through each step here in a minute. So, but just if you have access to a budget book, hard copy, or a link to the website, you can. This is page 20. So here I'll jump into the foundation formula. And again, it's a number of different steps that are taken to multiply from a starting point, come up with an adjusted enrollment, and then multiply times the BSA. And there's a few other steps after that. So I'll try not to go too fast here, but again, questions at the end, and then feel free to set up a time to come in and visit with me. The first multiplier is the school size adjustment. So if you see at the bottom of the page, the step one, that 12,191, and these are all FY23 numbers from last year. Okay, so they're not. Don't worry about them. That was our projected enrollment that we established last year. So don't worry about, well, we're at 12.6. These are old numbers. Okay, we're just wanting to understand the concept and how it works. So 12,191 is what we anticipated enrollment to be this year. We plug in at a school level all of the enrollments of every school in the district, all 30 some odd schools. Based on the size of those schools, it multiplies that number out for each school, and it adds additional ADM. And so from 12,191, we get 13,934. Now this, you've heard often of the hold harmless. This includes the last year of the hold harmless. I don't want to confuse folks, but that had to do with the significant massive drop in enrollment right here in 21. The state has like a slow, easy, if we were to lose all of that revenue all in fell swoop, we would have lost $30 million all at once. Well, the state has the formula has a hold harmless where they kind of brought us down gradually. Okay, so this 13,934 includes some hold harmless there. So that's the school size adjustment. So we go from 12,191 up to 13,934. The next multiplier is the district cost factor. This is kind of like cost of living adjustments for the different various districts around the state. It's a wide range. 1.0 is Anchorage. Okay, they're kind of the baseline. We here in Fairbanks are 7%. So you multiply 13,934 times 1.07. That hopefully is 14,909. Cost of living factor. You have districts out in the bush that some of them have 50%, 70%. I don't know what the highest one is, but there's some huge multipliers out there in the more rural bush village districts in the state. 7% here in Fairbanks. 14,909. Then we come to the special needs factor. This is the special ed multiplier. It's 20%. So we multiply 14,909 times 1.2, and we get 17,891. Our CTE multiplier is 1.5%. 1% of that is for high schools, 0.5% of that is for middle schools. So we take 17,891 and we multiply it times 1.015 to get an increase up to 18,159. We in Fairbanks here, this is also an important note. The state, it's called a block grant funding model, where it is not prescriptive in how we use our dollars. There's no dollars in the state foundation formula are prescriptive or directed. You district has to spend this money in this way, okay? So there's a CTE multiplier. Districts are not required to use those dollars on CTE. However, here in Fairbanks, we take great pride in the fact that we do track the amount of those dollars and we do spend those dollars on CTE activities within the district. Our intensive services funding, this isn't a percentage multiplier. This is a step where we identify those students with special needs in our district that are more intensive in nature. They might need more one-on-one partnership with educators. They're more costly to educate. And so the state gives us 13 times, they multiply each intensive needs student by 13. And that number is then added to the prior ADM. So 18,159. Right now, we are at 384 intensive needs students was the last number. And each year, there's a review process where the district submits our numbers and applications and packets to the state for review to confirm and establish that intensive student count. So this was also a key in our decline in funding over COVID. We lost approximately 30 to 40 intensive student counts. Each student is, and I don't like to quantify students, but that's each count is $77,000 in revenue to the district. So we lost about $2.5 million in funding in this one component through COVID. So 23,151, and then the last step is, I forgot to mention, the very first step is when you do the school size multiplier, the very first step, you subtract out your correspondence students before you start. So our best enrollment is subtracted out to start that process. Here at the end, we add back in 90% of those students. So we're at about 810 or so times 0.9, and then it's added. And this wasn't the case with these numbers, but that's what we would do now. So 90% of the best enrollment is added back in, 23,151 up to 23,804. And that becomes the adjusted ADM, there in parentheses. So we have 12,000 and change. In the funding formula, we end up at 23,804. Okay. Now, looking at the bottom blue line here on this slide, so that 23,804 adjusted ADM, we multiply that by the 5930 BSA, and that gives us our basic need of 141,872. More steps, fun. So the determination of, that establishes our basic need, the determination of final state aid. So right in the middle section, the colored lines, so the 141 million, there we see the basic need. We then subtract required local contribution. So through the formula, we establish a minimum required borough contribution. And we subtract that from the 141 million. Then we also subtract a portion, not all, but a portion of federal impact aid. The state is allowed to subtract that from our state funding, just shy of $8 million for the current year. And so then we arrive at 100,021,943. This, I want to take just a brief moment and talk about this middle green line. This is becoming, it's kind of been a non-issue over the past several years. It's becoming a massive issue. So what we see happening is what's happening with property values all over the country, and including here in Alaska and in Fairbanks. Property values rising significantly. The minimum required local contribution is based on assessed valuations here locally. And so it's kind of a reverse situation. As assessed valuations go up dramatically, it increases dramatically, about $3.5 million this year, the minimum required local contribution. So it increases that number that the state is subtracting from their state aid. See how that's a negative? It's right, wrong, or indifferent. I'm not saying either way here. I'm just pointing out this is a huge impactor of our budget right now that most people, it's flying under the radar. I think over the past several years, decades, maybe people weren't aware of this component, but now it's becoming it's hitting the district hard here. So if we're reducing state funding without any automatic mechanism for an increased funding anywhere else. Does that make sense? So the only way it would be an automatic increase is if a borough was funding at that minimum, right? So if they were funding at the minimum and their minimum increased, they'd be forced to pay it. But I'm not aware of any borough in the state that's funding at the minimum. If you're funding somewhere in the middle, there's no automatic mechanism for that increase to be, or the decrease in state funding to be picked up at the local level. The borough, the local municipality might indeed pick up that decrease in state funding, but might not. So obviously there's a process that we walk through to establish our local funding. So again, this is not an editorial comment, but in the state foundation formula, that mechanism is intentionally there, that as assessed valuations increase, there's a very intentional passing along of state aid onto the local municipalities. Okay, and it's not automatic. If the borough is funding it somewhere higher than that minimum, it's not going to be an automatic increase in funding. So that's where we find ourselves. And it's not an insignificant number. That number is going to jump from 33.9 up to 37 and change this year. So. Our budget calendar going forward, this kind of just establishes the really high level timeline. On February 1, administration presents to the Board of Education the proposed budget. That's our first, there's 3 drafts. The first is the proposed. That is on February 1. We typically will have our internal budget work done by the end of December, and then we spend the first 2 or 3 weeks of January just compiling everything and getting a finished document together, due to you folks on February 1. The board will then work that proposed budget for the next 2 months to come up with the recommended budget. That's the second iteration, and that goes across the river to the borough, the recommended budget. And there in that proposed budget that we submit, Ms. Moline and I submit to you, that has an ask. One of the main components is the ask of the borough. And the board will typically debate that number and either stick with what we have put forward or change that number. So that's and then in addition, the board is receiving input and feedback from stakeholders through a variety of different means over those 2 months to make changes that you see fit to that proposed budget. So recommended budget goes over on April 1. The borough then incorporates that budget and the ask of the borough into their borough budget. It's typically the largest single line item of the borough's budget, so it is significant. And then they typically have that decision made by the second week in May is usually where they'll finalize their budget and have the local contribution established. If it's at or very near what the district asks for it, oftentimes there's not a lot of changes needed from the recommended to the third final draft, the approved budget. But if it does go up or down, then the board would have decisions to make on how to either utilize additional dollars or additional cuts that need to be made if it goes down from the ask. And then the board, you folks are this body is typically done by the first week of June with your work. So just an outlook here for the FY24 budget, and estimate on the top line and the title, and then subject to change, and approximately is everywhere. These are preliminary numbers and subject to change on a daily, weekly basis. So right now we're looking at an estimated $16 million deficit. That deficit is made up of a few different components. The current CARES funds are covering about $11 million in expenditures that are deemed regular operating fund expenditures. There's a little over 12 million in there, but some of those items are kind of one-time type items. 11 million in what's considered ongoing general fund expenditures. That state revenue loss that I mentioned due to assessed valuation of $3 million. And then on the expenditure side, salary increases. We have granted step increases district-wide, as well as we did finalize a negotiated agreement with FPA, and there's a 1% salary increase for FPA in there. So those three and many other items make up a total of approximately $16 million, a preliminary budget deficit that we're facing. So as far as the outlook is concerned, how would the different levers be pulled to try to make up the gap? So certainly the local contribution adjustments can be made to that number as a way to start to bridge the budget deficit gap. In state funding, there will be significant advocacy to for the first time in 7 years, increase the base student allocation. There'll be a major push there. And then what we did receive for the current year from the state is one-time funding, where, in the event that we can't secure an increase to the BSA, that at minimum that some kind of one-time funding would be provided. And we certainly appreciate any dollars that we receive from any of our funding sources. The drawback to that one-time funding is we have to start from scratch each year, and we're unable to count those dollars in our budgeting process. So in many times, the one-time funding components might not be finalized until May or June even of the calendar year. And so when the district has to put forward a proposed budget in February, a recommended budget in April, and we can't count on any kind of an increase, even if it's being talked about at the state level or at the local level, if we can't count on those funding dollars 100%, we just cannot have those assumptions built into the budget. And unfortunately, the downside of that is it impacts staff tremendously. And that's the unfortunate piece that we try to avoid at all costs. So on the expenditure side, we have cost increases in virtually every area, whether it's staffing costs, whether it's utility costs. Utility is a significant, large single line item of our district. Increased in just the last 5-6 years, increased $2 million from seven and change up to 9 and change. So that's not news to anyone, just significant increases. Professional services across the board, seeing increases. And it's important to note that the deficit estimates that I am putting out do not include any kind of agreement or cost increases from our negotiations processes. So those could be additional increases to the deficit numbers. The CARES funds, this isn't necessarily on the expenditure side, more on the revenue side. CARES funds, we've been carrying anywhere from $10 to $12 million in CARES fund of expenditures on CARES funds the last 2 years. Unfortunately, we estimate we'll have about $5 million in CARES available for FY24. So that supplemental bucket is depleting, and then our fund balance currently is officially at zero based on the state calculation. So that's another funding source that we've utilized in the past to try to soften declines in staffing and in other areas. And unfortunately, that bucket is very much depleted as well. So we, as a district, are, back to the proposed budget, we are required to present a balanced budget. And so the way that this year is going to be different is, going back one slide, is really those last two bullet items are going to create a vastly, distinctly different process this year than what we've experienced in the past. We've relied heavily on CARES funds, federal relief dollars from the federal government. We've relied heavily on our own local internal fund balance, our cash reserves. Just kind of anecdotally, well, not anecdotally, literally, I arrived here 4 years ago. Our fund balance was at about $33 million, just over $30 million, and now we're at zero. So we have, we've held the line as long as we have been able to with these supplemental sources of income, and unfortunately, we're required to present a balanced budget, and that will mean that there's going to be some hard decisions. I've said this every year. I feel like I'm a broken record, and this year, barring some early miracle, so not just a miracle, but an early miracle that comes quickly, because proposed February 1 is just around the corner. So it's going to be a challenging budget environment, to say the least. So that is my presentation. Raced through that pretty fast, but here I'm happy to entertain as many questions as there are, and turn the time back over to you, President Sanderson.
Thank you, Mr. DeGraw. If the regular board doesn't mind, can I start with our two new board members? So I'll take Ms. Burnett first, and then Ms. Brett Hardy.
I guess I'm going to extremes here because I prefer the worst case scenario. That way things look better when it's not quite there. We're in pretty dire straits, it's obvious. Not that I want to utter the words, but how close are we to having to consider possible closures?
Of schools.
Yes, sir.
So that's something that, full disclosure, we have not been talking about internally at this point in time. We often, as we navigated last year, we got into this practice quite a bit because last year was a tough year. We talked often internally on, and this, I'm open book here, how much can our community take? How much change can folks take all at once? And so, our school closures, will they be on the table at some point in the future? Very possibly. Have there been discussions internally about impending closures at this time? No, we haven't had any discussions. But can I say that the door has closed completely on that conversation? No. I hope I answered your question.
Yeah, thank you.
So if I could add to that, before we went down that road, we would want to follow a process similar to what we did before. We'd want to make very intentional about what we looked at and get the data, get the information, but before we went down that road. So like Mr. DeGraw said, we haven't had those discussions internally, but that's where we are.
You have a follow-up?
Yeah, and I understand completely. I wouldn't even want to touch that, just to clarify. Like I said, I prefer to look at, a worst case conversation. So that's good to know. I appreciate it.
Yeah, and just to put a bow on that topic, what administration will be doing is looking, the basis by which we moved forward on that topic last year was looking at building capacities. And are we spending dollars maintaining space that isn't necessary? Are we funding brick and mortar buildings rather than trying to fund students' education and people? Are we unnecessarily putting dollars into brick and mortar buildings rather than trying to put as many dollars into people as possible? Because you know, and last year was a super tough process. It was, you know, I tell folks, you know, I went over and visited Joy. I went to Joy Elementary. I went from K through 2 at Joy Elementary, and I went over there and you know, met with the principal and a few staff members, and so, you know, that hit home, and so we don't take that lightly. But when we look at where do we want to invest our dollars in unnecessary space, and it's investing it, it's redirecting it to people, in that when you're in a deficit position, if you're saving dollars, you're not able to add more people, but you're able to reduce fewer people, is what it boils down to. If you can save dollars, it reduces the amount of cuts that you have to make in other areas. And we have realized the savings that we projected in our budget this year. So very difficult conversation and topic to broach, but one that, and if we do broach it again, it will be that we're looking at the numbers and we feel that it's a valid topic to bring up and to vet out and to include our stakeholders and see what the direction that folks want to go. So.
Ms. Hardy, go ahead.
Questions, just like how stuff works. Can the CTE funding factor increase, or is that like a set thing by the state that's given to every district?
I want to make sure I understand your question. Could you repeat that?
Well, like with like intensive students, it's based on how many students we have. Is
Yeah.
CTE just here is what you multiply for CTE, it doesn't change?
Correct. Yeah, it's taking that. So on that slide, it's taking that 17,891 and it's multiplying that by the 1.5% increase. And so it's not based on the number of students that are enrolled in class. It's just kind of a flat number based on that prior.
Choya, I have others, but if there's.
Okay, you can have another follow-up, and then I'll go to someone else.
With the local contribution, and this was something like, I've done a little studying on the foundation for me on that, but I know that there's the minimum contribution and there's also a maximum contribution, and at what point, and I know like if they go over, then it dings us too, and kind of it rolls into the idea of that $3 million in the state loss of revenue. Are we actually realizing that loss if the local borough did fund to the max, or like how does, because I know it's a tricky process.
Yeah, as long as they stay at the max or below, there is no hit to our state funding. And just for information for the board, that maximum is going to go up. Don't hold me to this, but right now it's somewhere in the mid 60s, 65, 66. It's going to go up to 68, 69 million ish. I haven't calculated that number yet, but it's going to go up. It won't be 70, but it'll be way high 60s.
Can I just follow up?
One more, yep.
Yeah, sorry. And so, but we currently aren't funding anywhere close to that max, right? We did higher than we asked for, and there was also additional funds, no disrespect to the borough, like
Correct.
where we asked and what we
Yep.
could ask for.
Yep, just stating the numbers, like I mentioned earlier, the minimum right now is in the 33.9. They funded us a little over 52, and then that max is somewhere 66-ish. So that's minimum, maximum, and then they funded us just a little over 52.
Ms. Marati?
Thank you. Can you describe how you calculate the max in broad terms, broad strokes?
Yeah, it's I'll get back to you on that one. There's one that's greater than, there's one that's less. I'll get that answer for you, Ms. Marati.
Okay. If you could give, maybe share that with the board
I
so
will.
that they know. I have 3 more questions, but I can hold if someone else does.
No, you can go ahead and ask another question. I don't see any more.
So one of the things that we're hoping for is an increase to the BSA, but the legislature failed to pass a significant increase to the BSA. We got 30, thank you.
Yeah.
What gives us any inclination that they're going to pass it this year?
You know, I hope that the stories that Fairbanks is telling and many other districts are telling are compelling. So, you know, I personally feel like we've done a lot of heavy lifting here in Fairbanks, that, you know, we just closed 3 school buildings. You know, how many districts closed down, you know, three buildings? That was, almost 10% of our schools right there. So, we're reducing in areas all across the district. We're doing a lot of heavy lifting, and hopefully, it shows folks in positions of decision-making that, we're making good faith efforts. Our expenditures since the last increase in the BSA in 2017 have increased about 9% in those years, 9% increase. And so, certainly there's a big gap there between where we were at in 2017 and where we're at now. Certainly, we appreciate the one-time funding. That is significant. That's helped us along. I think, there's been a lot of talk over the last couple of years about, well, there's a lot of federal funding there. There's CARES and ARPA funding, and I would just hope that as those funds are depleted, and they're depleting in many districts around the state, that that there's an awareness that safety net is disappearing. And so I think folks at the borough and folks at the state level, they have constituents in public schools, and I hope, I'm fearful of what we're going to have to do if we don't get any kind of permanent lifeline, and it won't be good for the school district. It won't be good for students. And that's really what it boils down to for me, is the impact to students and learning in the classroom. And obviously there's a big need there. So, and I hope to get out on the advocacy trail this legislative season and help explain. I'll be providing information to the board along that 9% that I just described. I'm going to put together some visuals and show the nuts and bolts of that deficit from 2017 and try to help folks understand where we stand and try to, put it in clear terms.
Ms. Smith?
Thank you. I do have several questions. So I will just start with, well, I guess I have three outlandish questions. So I'll just start with the most calm one. When we were in Anchorage this past week, the Association of Alaska School Boards put as one of our legislative priorities $860 or $70 increase to the BSA plus inflation proofing. That's a lot. But they did the math, and they say that in order to catch up from the flat BSA, that's where we need to be. And do you concur?
So obviously I can't speak to the methodology that they use to come up with that number. I've run some rough numbers for our district. About 6,600 BSA would get us mostly out of our deficit. So that's a little more than 600. About a $650 increase would get us there. That would be, complete, would level us up to where we're at today. The 9% that has the 9% increase, rough increase that we've seen since 2017, that would be at about 6,400. So, there's many different ways you can look at, hey, what should the BSA be increased to? I can't speak to what numbers they were looking at, but here in Fairbanks, those numbers would get us either largely out of our deficit or I don't want to say completely, but they would get us largely out of the hole we're in.
Go ahead, Ms. Smith.
Thank you. I really wanted to make sure that the public could hear that number and let it really sink in, because it takes a long time to reconcile with that kind of ask, and we need to start putting it out there today so that it can get reconciled with. I also have another question that is, who sets the timeline? It's in statute, it's in various policies, like we have to give it to the borough because it's in their policy. And would you recommend a change, or how do we fix that we don't even know what our funding is? Do you have any dreams of how that would change?
Yeah, wow, this is getting real crazy now. Yeah, a component of the funding formula that created a more timely, solid number earlier on absolutely. And I, I have experience in other environments that in other funding formulas that provide that. So that's the timing of it, and there's many negatives to the timing, and not the least of which is, having to notify staff members that at this point you don't have a job in the budget. That's just hugely damaging to our system. And so a mechanism of the funding formula that establishes known funding much farther in advance than June, that's just, it's really, really damaging to school districts all over the state of Alaska. And so it can be done. Can I get into the nuts and bolts and details? No, but I know through direct experience that it's possible.
And if I just can follow up on a piggyback off of Ms. Smith, I asked that question to you last year about that because the state demands that we submit something, but it doesn't, our count that that we have to take and then report that our whole budget is based on that count. And then when we have to submit our budget, so that might be something we could advocate for, a change in that statute to make it, work for us, because this is not working. But anyway, I just had to make that comment from last year. Is there any more follow-up questions? Ms. Marati, go ahead.
Thanks. And I wanted to thank Ms. Smith through the chair for those great questions. I feel like we have some savings this year. We're not fully using our bus contract. We have many vacancies. Are you projecting any kind of savings? I've asked this before and was told to hold tight. So now that we're talking about it again, I feel like I can ask, are we gonna see any savings that can then impact that $16 million deficit?
So, yeah, the problem, and that question gets asked of me often, and the answer to it when there is vacancies is yes, those savings go back into fund balance. And the problem, but is that we're at zero on the state calculation for fund balance. So fund balance, just for new board members, we'll talk about fund balance often in two different terms: the state, and then the local fund balance is a different way to calculate that. So welcome to the crazy world of fund balance. And the reason why I say we're at zero, but our bank account isn't necessarily at zero, is because we receive impact aid. So that federal portion of our revenue, impact aid, we receive it in advance. So we're receiving impact aid now for next year. And so the way that you can still have dollars in the bank but be at zero is the state allows you to subtract that because they acknowledge that it's for next year. So if we're at zero and our impact aid advance is 10 million, but we only have 5 million in the bank, that means we're pre-spending our impact aid when it's really meant for. So, a short answer to your question, Ms. Marati, is yes, we are seeing vacancies this year. Those savings are deposited into fund balance. But at this point, we've pre-spent some impact aid, and so we're still at zero. We might bump up out of zero at the end of this year. But again, a district our size ought to have a fund balance of, $10, $15 million at minimum, in my opinion. So yeah.
Go ahead, Ms. Marati, with your follow-up.
Thank you. I hear what you're saying. You can't predict the future. I just hope that we can get regular updates on the savings from not just vacancies, but busing as well. I know that there's savings in both areas that could be significant and could help that $16 million deficit. I have another follow-up though for saying that we have a zero fund balance. I recall that the board voted to take that 50 million that was then 5 million to our district and put that into the fund balance. What happened?
And we're still at zero, meaning, so, I can, at a future work session, when I give some numbers and visuals, I can go over this topic. This would probably be a good topic to cover in a future work session, but real quickly, and again, it's a confusing topic, but the state allows us, so let's say we're slated to receive $10 million this year, intended for next year. If we have $10 million at the end of the year, and it's that $10 million that is a fund balance that's intended for next year. Okay? So we have $10 million in the bank intended to spend next year. The state allows us to subtract that for our current, right now, what's our fund balance, and it calculates to zero. So I probably not.
I think I'm gonna need a work session on
Yeah,
that.
but we can
Thanks.
do that. We can do that.
Okay, Mr. Dorn?
Appreciate that question, and I'll take it off my list. Clarification on school size adjustment. If I understand this correctly, and I'm not looking at the numbers per se, but we would, for this year, we had backed out 3 schools that we closed. Next year, we're projecting to add 1 school that would be a factor on this, and that'd be North Star College. Is that correct?
Yeah, so that plays into the overall deficit. Those numbers are baked into the cake. Yes, the 3 that were backed out as part of the cost, the revenue impact to the district of closing the schools, there was a loss of about $500,000 for each school that was closed. And then that offset savings that were realized through the closing of the school. So those 3 school closures dropped our state revenue about $1.5 million compared to if we had moved forward status quo. And then the standing up of North Star College added about $960,000 to the formula, to the state funding revenue, foundation revenue.
Okay, more than each of the others.
So
So each one lost 500. We're
Correct.
looking at 960 for some reason.
Correct.
Okay.
Yep.
And in terms of the hold harmless on that one, so that will reduce all of our school size adjustment by a certain amount.
So hold harmless for FY24 is done. So hold harmless, now it's finished at the end of FY23. And so for the FY24 budget, it becomes actual enrollment.
Okay, great. Thanks for that.
Just for the new board members, the hold harmless would take a portion of the students that we lost and add those students in. They'd give us above and beyond what our actuals were. And it's a slow step down, and it's done at the end of FY23. So for FY24, it becomes actual enrollment. I have found what makes up the maximum contribution. It's the minimum plus, this is why I couldn't just rattle it off. I take pride in being able to just rattle stuff off. This is crazy. The minimum plus the greater of the full assessed valuation times 2 mils or the current year basic need times 23%. So the greater of the full assessed valuation times 2 mils, take that value, and then you take the current year basic need times 23%. The bigger number there, you add to the minimum. That's how you come up with the maximum.
Okay, Ms. Smith?
Okay, so now I'm down the line on
Crazier?
crazy.
All right.
You know, one of the things that we always talk about is that we can't generate any revenue. And that nothing is really under our own control. And I know that in other states, school districts have taxing power. They have their own need, and they assess value, and they separately tax and in other states. I just want to put it on the record that that's a thing. And that, you know, people talk a lot about that Fairbanks North Star Borough has a high mill rate or high taxes, but at this point, we're kind of getting what we pay for with our schools. And I just wonder if you think that's accurate. Or you know, if the people really want great schools and really want the outstanding programs that we have, that we see in other places, they have to be paid for. And there's a lot of different ways to do that. If it takes a citizen ballot initiative to say we want to put a certain amount of money in these mills of our property tax are going directly to education, instead of this haphazardness that we have about begging for every dollar, that the citizens of this community could say, we want these mills to go to school. And that would be, am I correct that that would be one way to create a somewhat more reliable number to come from the borough for us?
Yeah, and there's been conversations along those lines. Matsu Borough has a similar formula by which they establish their local contribution. So that would be I would be supportive of, as long as that's the right number, it's the right formula that generates, you know, an adequate amount. So yeah, I would be in favor of that type of setup. I think, if I may.
Go ahead, Mr. DeGraw.
Thank you, President Sanderson. I think it boils down to, yeah, is public education a priority? I think that's the fair question to ask, you know, and that's not a rhetorical question. We've, at the state level, I'm not speaking at the borough level now, just at the state level, you know, we haven't seen from 17 to 23, that's 6 consecutive years of flat funding. You know, there was some one time in there that we appreciate, but as far as the numbers that we can count on, it's been 6 consecutive years. Our costs have continued to increase, and we've held the line as long as we can, and we've closed schools, we've made cuts. Just to give some perspective, oftentimes in a cut environment, and folks that look at, you know, ways that they feel they can improve public education is, well, you know, it's top heavy, cut administration, et cetera, et cetera. This, I have these numbers for perspective. We could bulldoze this entire building and we would gain about $11 million. 11. So our deficit's 16 and growing. $11 million is what this building costs. And mind you, many of the services that come out of this building are direct supports to classrooms in the district. In the IT department, you have network services, user services. They're dealing with devices and computers and Chromebooks. So just to give context and perspective of how long it's been and how deep the hole is, that I hope that gives folks, we could never eliminate this building. You know, we have to have an account. You know, do we just get rid of our technology department? You know, we have to have a human resources department. We have to have an accounting department. We have to have a technology department. So we could never do that. I say that just to give context and the size of the deficit that we're facing. And it boils down to, you know, do we, and I think it's a fair question, do we value public education? And, you know, if we do, let's see how we try to make it better. And, you know, to some folks, it might not be as valuable, but I think the majority of Alaskans support and want a good, solid public education. There's study after study that links society and positives in society to a strong public education. So I went on a major rant there, Ms. Smith, I apologize. But you know, I think it's important to ask that question and to establish an answer. And whatever the answer is, you know, then move forward based on those feelings.
Ms. Burnett?
Actually, appreciate Miss Smith's comment there. I'm gonna go a little crazy here. My experience just as a parent, especially in like the sports area of things. I know we have a lot of community partners out there. We have a lot of parental members. We have a lot of people who are willing to help. I know that we have a lot of costs ahead of us, a lot of things we're looking at cutting and stuff. How about looking into our booster programs, our PTAs, our community partners to maybe sponsors, you know, kind of pander to them and say, hey, look, this is what we're faced with. These are our cuts that we're having to look at. If you would like to, like you say, if we value public education, which I think every single one of us does, is this something that is within our power to do? I know that we don't really generate a lot of funding, but if it's a sponsor, if it's just something that's given from our public, wouldn't that work?
Yeah, so that certainly would be a way to, you know, offset reductions in the activity world. Activities have been reduced over time. There was an increase in last year's budget that was restored by the board there in late May or early June. There, you know, I would just say so to answer your question, yes, yes, we can. And then it's a balancing act, right? And we go through these debates internally all the time of, you know, if we reduce activities, what kind of burden does that place on the next stakeholders? So community partnerships with businesses and things like that, that would be a great thing to look at. You know, then, you know, you have the debate of the fees being charged to families, right? And so if we're reducing in the activity world in our general fund budget, what kind of burden does that place on our families and students around the district? So, you know, can that be picked up by organizations, business partners? Absolutely, that's a strategy that we'll take.
And I would add to that, it's really loud. I would just add to that each board meeting, we read the contributions from our community. So I think we have a community that's invested and is willing to invest. I'm always amazed by that list of people that do partner with our district and invest in those particular, a lot of them are activity-related investments.
Ms. Hardy?
Just because it's kind of germane to the conversation, I do know that there is a group that wants to be more active and they're trying to get into the principal, like K-12 or K-8 principal meeting. Mr. Nichols is one of those in the Chamber of Commerce, and I really encourage, I don't know, through the chair, that we encourage that support. They have worked with the New Jerseys from Tannenall Middle School and trying to do other stuff. Our community definitely wants to get behind us and making that access. And I've had discussions with Mr. Nichols about how we can make that a more sustaining contribution instead of something that's done piecemeal here or there. And that might be something the administration, through the chair, might want to look into or contact.
I'll just make a comment before I call on you, Mr. Dorn. I believe that partnerships and first let me say this. I believe that the ESSA, when it was developed after we got out of the No Child Left Behind, I always felt that it gave us, and I could be off here, but I always felt that it gave us an opportunity to kind of write the blueprint for our district and for what our students needed and how that would be supported. It seemed to be a law that was more open, more flexible, and that we had more say in how it came down for our students. And I just wonder, you know, I've read some other articles from other districts, you know, of how they're pushing that box and, you know, using it in different ways. And I was just curious if we've had any sort of think about how we could push it out to be able to, if you kind of get what I mean. I'm probably not clear as mud here.
I'm not exactly sure what you're talking about, but if you're talking about the federal funding through Title I funds and the ESSA funding that we get,
So I'm sort of talking about the law itself as to how we could, how our districts um, give the services of education to our students. That's what I'm really talking about.
Right, and that is a federal law. So any money that we get from the federal government has certain restrictions that are on it, and that is separate than our general fund money. So, so we do try to maximize those dollars that we get from the federal government to try to run as many programs and as efficiently as we possibly can with those monies within the perimeters, because they all have those boundaries. But that money is separate from what we have to deal with as a board and as a district with our general fund money. And where it's appropriate, will braid funds or add to make it a more expanding program. But we have to be really careful when we work with those federal funds that we're supplementing and not supplanting. So following all of those guidelines within the federal funding that we have, and I think we do a pretty good job. Well, Denali Elementary is an example of that. They were just recognized for the work that they've done as a Title I school, and they get those ESSA funding that comes from the federal government. So I think we are working that way and very intentionally. And that's separate than our general fund dollars, which we want to see the same thing, the same maximizing efforts from our general fund as we get from our federal dollars.
For the clarification. Ms. Smith?
Thank you. I just wanted to make another statement. I'm trying to think up a way for it to be a question, but I don't know. It's not going to happen. I just want to say that I'm looking forward this year to advocating for funding for education, and that I think that it's time to have a conversation with the public about what fully funded education looks like. I know that I have asked that before, and I'd really like to see us create a booklet or a model of what really fully funded, what appropriate class sizes, what well-maintained buildings, and full slate of offerings so kids could take in-person classes to get all of their credits to graduate in their own building. What dollar sign is attached to that? And then to really think about if you can give up a $5 a day coffee to support that, because in the scheme of mill rates increases or borough contribution increase in the per household in the borough, it's not that much, I don't think. Maybe I'm wrong on that, but in my math, it's not that much. And I'm a single income family. I have a lot of children, and I want to see that education just be what it's meant to be. And I also want to encourage the board that providing a safe place for families to find school to be their partner, and continuing on a path that Ms. Moline has been talking about often, of partnering with parents, making sure that we're not trying to usurp parents, because families who feel that the school district is trying to usurp their position or change their family values when they send their kids to school are not going to get on board with what we're asking of them. We're going to ask a lot of our community over the next 6 months. So we need to maintain a safe environment for families to send their children to.
Mr. Dorn? Oh, I'm sorry, Mr. McGraw, you have a follow-up there?
Yeah, just before Mr. Dorn, just to
Okay.
follow up on Ms. Smith's comments. And, a couple minutes ago, I said, the question, is public education a priority? The next step beyond that is, and Ms. Smith was getting at this, defining what an adequate education is, defining the basket of goods, so to speak. So, if we're talking crazy pie in the sky, coming up with different timeline on funding that's earlier and reliable. It's also what makes up an adequate education, classrooms of X number of students and this many support aides, this in our special education arena, what does an adequate education for our students look like? It's defining that, and then what does that cost realistically? And that's how we get to, and then we provide that, whatever that costs, we provide that funding in an adequate time to where districts can make good decisions. And that's taking it a step further. And yes, I would be wholeheartedly willing to be part of a process to look at those things and establish those types of improvements, in my opinion. So,
Mr. Dorn?
I have a comment and a question, but I do want to underscore and emphasize what Mrs. Smith has been saying in terms of the budget, and other board members have also chipped in on it, because we need the public to talk to our legislators. It's a state responsibility to fund public education, and it really struck me last year when the legislature was presented with data that showed that Alaska has the lowest investment in public education of any state in the nation. And it's about time that we turn that around, and our legislators and governor needs to be well aware of that. But it's only if the public really says, what do we want for schools? So thank you for those comments from the different board members. Question on the correspondence program. And I really appreciate it because I hadn't really understood how the correspondence are backed out at the very beginning of our enrollment and then put in just at this very end at a 0.9 factor. But my question is, students who are enrolled in BEST but are taking courses in the regular high schools, and I'm mindful of the fact that if a correspondence student from another district comes here and takes a course in our district, we get a percentage. If it's our own correspondence student who's at 0.9 in BEST but are taking courses within our own schools, does that factor in at all, or?
I'd have to get back to you on that one, Mr. Doran. I can make that note, unless Ms. Moline has an answer off the cuff. So make sure I understand, it's our correspondence students that take one or two courses at a physical building.
Right, which I know would be a very small percentage. I mean, I know it's a minimum of a quarter, it could be up to a half or whatever the factor is, but does it
But
give us a boost?
that might be 0.33
Right.
that you're saying would go through the multipliers.
Right.
And yeah, let me check into that and find out.
I could give an answer off the cuff, but I don't know that it would be right. So I'll just wait.
Fair enough, I'm patient. Thank you.
Are there any more, board comments before we conclude our meeting tonight? Mr. Dorn?
Quick clarification on the determination of final state aid. The impact aid money, though it's backed out of our state aid, that is money that actually comes into our coffers. Is that right?
Yes.
Or do they take and that's less what the state takes off the top?
Correct. So if the amount, so the amount showing there is a little under 8 million, that's a portion of the total impact aid that we received for that year. So, but
But it's
typically,
into our coffers.
correct,
Right.
correct. So then what's important to note is the impact aid dollars that we receive, we're receiving on one hand and losing a little on the other. So It's usually about 0.6 something of those impact aid dollars that's the net gain.
Okay. Well, next, we have board comments. Ms. Smith.
I just wanted to thank Senator Myers for sitting in on our meeting and
Thank
for waiting patiently through our executive session. It was very long.
Ms. Burnett.
And thank you, Mr. DeGraw, for sitting here and explaining that all to us.
No, are there any other further comments? If not, I would entertain a motion to adjourn.
Motion to adjourn.
Second.
We're adjourned. Thank you.